Hello, everyone. So I'm hello, everyone. Welcome to West Hatch. I'm very sorry that you're unable, as external students, to join us this week for the Key Stage 5 induction lessons we're doing in the English department. However, I have decided that the best thing we can do, because I think the content that we cover in these induction lessons should give a good grounding for the course. So the best thing that I can do for you is just record and share the PowerPoints and talk over what we've been doing and discussing in the lessons. Obviously, this isn't going to be the equivalent of or the perfect equivalent the real lesson, because you lose some of the or all of the dialogue with your fellow classmates. But I think it's probably the best we can do in the circumstances. I also neglected to introduce myself. I'm Mr. Bundred. I'm the Key Stage 5 coordinator for English literature and English language and literature courses in West Hatch, of which I believe that you are planning to join one of. So, and our induction lessons are the same for each of those two courses. So, right, first let's share this PowerPoint with you. And can I find the PowerPoint I need? For a good start. Bear with me on this. Given the amount of Teams teaching you've done, you would assume we would be a little bit more experienced, or at least me, at getting things into Teams quickly. Right, so the PowerPoint should be coming up now. It should be loading into your screen. On. There we go. So, presenting now. Now, the first lesson is Essentials of Feminism. We're going to talk about feminism over 2 lessons here. First thing to get you acquainted with is a bit of the history of women's writing, and there's another lecture on this on my YouTube channel, which I'd suggest you watch for independent study. It was required watching for the West Hatch students, existing students rather than our new incoming students. But as I do now, I'd like you to sort of think around the answers to these questions. Who are the earliest significant female writers you can name? Now, for a lot of you, that answer won't stretch back before the 19th century, possibly the late 18th century. Some of you may think Mary Shelley at the turn of the century, Jane Austen. But few of you will be able to name a female playwright writing in the 17th century, female writer writing in the 17th century, for example. Still less one of the 16th century. Where are female Shakespeares? Where are our female Chaucers? There is one, and there are a couple. Well, there's one significant female playwright writing about 60 years after Shakespeare, Aphra Behn, which tends to be almost forgotten by history. There's a movement going on in sort of academic circles to bring her back. And we're starting to see a resurgence in popularity for Aphra Behn. But her popularity now certainly doesn't match nearly the popularity she had in her time and immediately posthumously. And then it's very difficult to name any before that. There's one notable exception, and she is in a bust on the right of that slide. In terms of what students understand the term feminism to mean, we find that feminism as a struggle for female equal rights is pretty well understood. But while that certainly could be considered to be the core of feminism, it's a little bit of a simple view of feminism. And it's not going to help us when we come to applying feminist literary lenses, when we come to looking at texts through feminist perspectives. And through answering this green question, by the way, if you have me, or if you have any PowerPoint that I've created, which tends to suffuse across the departments, there are 3 classes, of which I take 1 each year, although 2 last year. Blue questions are core questions which everyone's expected to answer, and green questions are challenge questions. They're a little bit more of extensions. When I taught this yesterday, for a single female writer you've read, explain how their experience of womanhood could be said to contribute to their writing. One of the students in the literature class on, we have 3 aspects, 3 bands on Q side, I think, talked about reading Sylvia Plath recently and how her experience of womanhood shapes the bell jar. But other than that, there are a lot of, I'd say all students have read works by women writers, usually many of them, but not really considered how their experience of womanhood shapes their writing, or whether it indeed does shape their writing. We tend to think about Victorian female writers as publishing under male pseudonyms. So the Bells for the Bronte, and I'd argue that Currer Bell and Ellis Bell were ambiguously gendered then, but certainly obviously not Charlotte Bronte's name or Emily Bronte's name. And obviously the most famous being George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans. But it's not really true that a huge number of female novelists were adopting male pen names. It tends to have been a sort of relatively niche thing. For example, Jane Austen, who wrote before all of them, never adopted a male pen name. In fact, when her books were published anonymously, they were published under the pen name A Lady. Anne Radcliffe also is another person who never adopted a male pseudonym. So it certainly wasn't mandatory at the time to get your texts published, which is something that's incorrectly taught and incorrectly believed by a lot of people. But that ambiguous gendering of names is something we still see today. So you'll note that the Harry Potter books aren't written by Jacqueline Rowling, they're written by J.K. Rowling. Those initials are intentionally ambiguously gendered. And sorry, we have automatic lights here. Intentionally ambiguously gendered, and ambiguously gendered in order to sell the Harry Potter books to boys. This idea that boys won't read books written by a woman because of this perception that they're girly. Does that shape the writing of it? Does it shape the readership of it? You know, even when selling books that appeal to children of both genders, it's really important that there's a male protagonist. And when we look at books with male protagonists written by women, is there an aspect of womanhood, an aspect of femininity, female experience, which may have crept in there, something oblivious to the surface reading of the novel? It's interesting considering how Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the depiction of the monster depicts from Bram Stoker's Dracula. With Stoker's Dracula, we see continual images of penetration, sperm dripping candles, of the transfusing of blood continuously with one of the female characters. When we see Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the earlier text, the relationship between Dr. Frankenstein and his creature, Adam, is oddly reminiscent to some feminist scholars of the experience of postpartum depression. So, as I said, overview of what we're doing this week. We're looking at basic introductions to critical and literary theories, perspectives that can be used to evaluate and understand how texts respond to and reflect the societies that they were written in and are received in. And this is a key difference between study of English at GCSE and study of English at A level. When we study English at A level, we don't have that sort of, simplistic AO3 context that we bolt in. We can say something about when Shakespeare was right, something about when Dickens was right. We actually look at texts through lenses that talk about the interpretations that we put on them as readers and that readers put on them. And this comes from this key understanding, which is that a text does not just exist within the author's head. I can't teach you a text and say, this is right, this is everything there is to know about a text, because that's not true. It's everything I know about a text because it's everything I've experienced of a text. But your experiences may be different. The experience of the text is actually co-constructed between writer and reader. We can't leap in to Chaucer's head and say what he was thinking. And so as a result, the meaning may change between times and between audiences. Othello is one of the first texts that we study on both courses. And the treatment of race in Othello and how significant race is as a factor in Othello is something that's changed continuously over the hundreds of years that Othello has been in production. And when you study English, you're taking part in a conversation that's been going on for thousands of years. It's not the study of a science. There aren't concrete proofs. There aren't things that are impossible to disprove. You take a position in these ongoing arguments of interpretation, and that position should be open to challenge. It's one that a good student of literature will continuously change as you develop in knowledge and you grow in perspective. As you grow up, as you come to read these texts, as adults, you'll put entirely different constructions on them. And one of our ambitions here is not just to produce students who go to outstanding universities. We typically target the Russell Group in our English courses, and we find the vast majority of our students do get into Russell Group universities. But it's not just your experience of English as an undergrad. It's not just the bachelor's degree that you'll get in English or a related subject. It's your lifelong appreciation of literature. Quick note, which is the minimum expectations for independent study. Now, not all independent study is set. You are expected to do an hour of independent study for every hour in the classroom. So where you're not being set independent study with a prescribed, you must do this, that doesn't mean you can slack off. It means you need to get to the texts that are on the recommended reading list. It means you need to be reading broadly around your subject. It means you need to be immersing yourself in the subject field. You have far fewer hours of contact time teaching at A-level, contact time in a classroom, but you need to match the contact time you do have in a classroom with independent study. And if you don't do that, you will find that you fall behind. There's a lot more work at A-level. So a lot of this independent study, as I say, is self-directed research. Reading non-course texts as well is going to be a part of it, because of course literature, as I say, it's an ongoing conversation. As an ongoing conversation, it's influenced by multiple other conversations, by multiple other voices. There's a recommended reading list in your course handbook. Obviously, you're not yet on the course teams. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the list of course texts for English literature, and on the right-hand side, you'll see them for English language and literature. You'll note that it's shorter for language and literature, and language and literature also has an aspect of stylistics and an aspect of linguistics that we don't really have to the same extent on the literature course, certainly not linguistics. The vast majority of these texts can be viewed through a feminist lens, and that's not the only lens we have available to us to view them through, but it's one of those lenses, it's one of those critical approaches, and it's about creating a toolkit for you. So when we say that there's been a real absence of women really writing before the end of the 18th century, it's the absence of women as speakers, not an absence of women as objects. And so the first text that we talk about in terms of the Western canon, the literature that shaped the Western world, is the Iliad. And Helen of Troy, of course, around 800 BC, when Homer's writing this, exists as an object to be fought over by warring men. We'll talk a fair bit about the Iliad when we begin in aspects of tragedy in September, where we start with Aeschylus's Agamemnon, and understanding Agamemnon requires quite a bit of understanding of the Greek experience and the literature of the Trojan War. However, Helen barely speaks. She doesn't speak in the Iliad at all. The first woman to write literature in the Western canon is probably, and there's a lot of literature that's missing. So the first person to write literature in Western civilization, but it's probably Sappho. Sappho's a lyric poet from the island of Lesbos. She lived between about 630 BC to 570 BC. As we get further back in time, dates are difficult to be that exact on. Very little of her poetry survives. She's believed to have written about 10,000 lines. There's much, much less than that still existing. And one of the poems that survives, or the longest fragment that survives complete, is an ode to Aphrodite. And in this ode to Aphrodite, and the homoerotic undertones that have been read, plus a tale about her relationship with female students. And it's difficult to say whether they're students, whether they're acolytes, how you define that relationship with younger females who looked up to her, has led to the island that she came from, Lesbos, becoming the origin of the modern term lesbian, called by some very old-fashioned people sapphic love. But when we talk about Greek literature, it's a modern misconception to talk about things in terms of homosexuality and heterosexuality. they wouldn't have thought of this concept as it exists now. So if you think about, for example, Achilles in the Iliad, he gets incredibly angry. The wrath of Achilles that starts off the Iliad in medias res is over the loss of a female sex slave. However, the other aspect of the wrath of Achilles is about the death of his male lover. And when we think about Plato's Symposium, the dialogue on love, the Socratic dialogue on love that exists several hundred years later, there's a concept of people having soulmates who are the same gender or opposite genders, but it's not thought of in terms of that lens of heterosexual or homosexual. And in fact, that concept itself is dismissed by Socrates, which is one of the things. The origin for our idea of soulmates is from a text where Socrates actually says that's rubbish. And there's a lot of these men in the Symposium, while most of them are married to women, they seem to have had sexual relationships with each other or been in love with each other. And so the Greeks don't think of Sappho as being a lesbian poet. It's an idea that comes later. They view her as a writer of love poetry in general. And when she's being portrayed by Aristophanes around 540 BC, so shortly after her death, she's usually seen in Aristophanes' comedies as being with men. And indeed, one of the stories about Sappho is about her love of a ferryman called Phaon. When we say, talk about Sappho's students, there is no surviving work from any of Sappho's students, if they wrote at all. And so voices of women that are unmediated by men, where men aren't telling us what women think, disappear almost entirely from Western literature. And they disappear almost entirely from Western literature for about 2,000 years. The first female playwrights and novelists don't appear until the 17th century. Now, there are a lot of reasons to speculate about why there's this gap. One of the things that happens, of course, is the rise of Christianity, and probably the denial of female spaces. The refusal to educate an awful lot of women, and cultural facts about how a woman's position should be read. And it's worth talking about the destruction or the loss of Sappho's poetry, which is, why do we have the extant works of Homer and not the extant works of Sappho? Especially given that it's clear that at her time, and for a few hundred years afterwards, Sappho was absolutely thought of as being one of the great poets. So something happens in Western civilization, or a combination of cultural and societal factors happen, and they erase women's voices. So the next time we can talk about women in literature is really the 17th century. In the 17th and 18th century, there's a huge rise in the number of women writing narratives that foreground female perspectives. And by the time of the Romantic era, so at the very start of your poetry anthologies, whichever poetry anthology you have, there are a substantial number of books written by women, and there are literate women who can read them. They tend to sit within the upper and upper middle classes, obviously. So the end of the 18th century, 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft is the mother of Mary Shelley, making her, the mother-in-law to Percy Bysshe Shelley, writer of Ozymandias, wrote the first significant feminist text. started what we talk about as being the first wave of feminism, a vindication of the rights of women. And Mary Wollstonecraft has a problem with the texts that are being written about women and the texts that are being written by women, which is the idea that women are in some way psychologically different to men. If you claim that that's fundamentally true, then you allow men to get away with certain forms of oppression of women. An obvious one is the failure to educate. So she believes that women are placed in a position subservient to men, beneath men, because of their inequality of education. Men deny women education, and then, having denied women education, decide that women are too, unserious, too hysterical, too vain, too small-minded to even be worthy of education. So it's a vicious cycle that keeps women oppressed. And she rejects the literature that's written by women of her time. And she attacks that literature for perpetuating the inequality. She thinks that women are also part of this problem, partly because of their focus on the domestic, not the political. When I say the focus on the domestic, I mean, if you think about how Jane Austen novels are largely about getting the right marriage. And Mary Wollstonecraft thinks that if you're going to be serious as a woman novelist, you should be more likely to attack the institution of marriage as being one that oppresses women. And it's not just that, it's the promotion of female sensibility, promotion of women as being very emotional, the Gothic trope of women always in tight corsets, fainting all of the time. She thinks all of that actually, even if written by women and even if read by a female audience, it's an attack on women, effectively. And so men and educated upper class women who aren't overly hurt by this system of oppression, really, they have money, they have power, they have status. Even if their power is limited, their power is extraordinarily high compared to a working class person. She thinks all of these people are conspiring to ensure that women are kept inferior and that women are denied rights. Not only denied rights, aren't even equipped to seek them, aren't equipped to engage in political life because of their lack of education. So they conspire to ensure female inferiority and then to deny women rights on the basis of the inferiority that they've conspired to ensure. Now, there's an underlying claim here which becomes a principle of feminism, and is a claim that is becoming increasingly controversial, which is that the psychological differences between men and women are entirely socially conditioned. If you think about it, even if we say that, you go to mixed gender schools, boys and girls have the same education. Well, no, you don't. Because from the time that you were an infant, if you're a girl, you were probably given a plastic baby to look after. And if you were a boy, you were given a bunch of tools to make stuff with. If you think about the narratives, the stories that are wound up around female dolls, Barbies, Brats, all of those, they all have boyfriends, they like shopping. They receive gifts. Boys' toys, action men, G.I. Joes, they don't have that. They're never conceived of through even having a girlfriend, through having a significant other. But this argument about there being no different girl and boy brains, just social conditioning, is one that leads from time to time, and especially more now, to conflicts between feminists and those advocating for trans rights. It's a worthwhile conflict to bear in mind. They're not mutually exclusive, but certainly in aspects of our contemporary society, they can seem to be opposed. All right, so extract from A Vindication of the Rights of Women. I can't really stick these documents here, so I'm just going to read it to you. And while I read it to you, I want you to consider those 5 questions. It's from the introduction. I have turned over various books written on the subject of education and patiently observed the conduct of parents and the management of schools. But what has been the result? A profound conviction that the neglected education of my fellow creatures is the grand source of the misery I deplore, and that women in particular are rendered weak and wretched by a variety of concurring causes, originating from one hasty conclusion. The conduct and manners of women, in fact, evidently prove that their minds are not in a healthy state. For, like the flowers that are planted in too rich a soil, strength and usefulness are sacrificed to beauty, and the flaunting leaves, after having pleased a fastidious eye, fade, disregarded on the stalk, long before the season when they ought to have arrived at maturity. One cause of this barren blooming I attribute to a false system of education gathered from the books written on this subject by men who, considering females not as human creatures, have been more anxious to make them alluring mistresses than rational wives. And the understanding of the sex has been so bubbled by this specious homage that the civilized women of the present century, with few exceptions, are only anxious to inspire love when they ought to cherish a nobler ambition, and by their abilities and virtues exact respect. There's a few things worth noting in that paragraph. The idea that women's strength and usefulness is being sacrificed to beauty, that women are being viewed through lenses, what we now talk about as being, what second wave feminists would talk about as being the male gaze, where the important thing is that they're appealing to the eye. Not that they're useful, that women are essentially useless objects. That women are anxious, that they view themselves through this perspective themselves. They're anxious to inspire love, not to exact respect. It's important in the conditioning, the education of women to please others, and not just to please men, not actually to develop their independence, their abilities, and their virtues, and view themselves as being equals. And this is something that Wollstonecraft thinks is true in the education, both in terms of the education schools, and this, of course, remember, is a time in which there's single sex education, fewer girls are educated than boys, but those that are educated in single sex environments, and they're taught entirely different things. But she thinks that there's also an aspect of social education, and that can be found in novels, where a girl's getting their ideas from, their ideas of what it is to be a woman. Yet, because I am a woman, I would not lead my readers to suppose that I mean violently to agitate the contested question respecting the equality and inferiority of the sex. But as the subject lies in my way, I cannot pass it over without subjecting the main tendency of my reasoning to misconstruction. I will stop a moment to deliver in a few words my opinion. In the government of the physical world, it is observable that the female in general is inferior to the male. The male pursues, the female yields. This is the law of nature. It does not appear to be suspended or abrogated in favour of women. The physical superiority of men cannot be denied, and it's a noble prerogative. But not content with this natural preeminence, men endeavour to still sink us lower, merely to render us alluring objects for a moment, and women, intoxicated by the adoration which men under the influence of their senses pay them, do not seek to obtain a durable interest in their hearts, or to become the friends of the fellow creatures who find amusement in their society. I'm aware of an obvious influence from every quarter. Have I heard exclamations against masculine women? But where are they to be found? If by this appellation men mean to inveigh against their ardour in hunting, shooting, and gaming, I shall most cordially join in the cry. But if it be against the imitation of manly virtues, or more properly speaking, the attainment of those talents and virtues, the exercise of which ennobles the human character, and which raise females in the scale of animal being, when that you've comprehensively termed mankind, all those who view them with a physical eye must, I think, wish with me that may every day grow more and more masculine. So one of the things she says here is that there's a challenge raised from male society and to an extent from female society that says that women have to be feminine, have to know their place. But actually, do we find any really manly women in that term? She believes that the issue is that there are too few, but she can't really find any. And what do you mean manly? If you mean manly in terms of women who spend all of their time hunting, shooting, and gaming, then yeah, by all means condemn that. She doesn't care about that. But if what you're criticizing with manly women is women who are brave, women who fight for what they believe, women who are well educated and serious and involved in the sciences and mathematics and things that are traditionally thought of as a male preserve even now, well, then she thinks that every woman should wish, every sensible woman should wish to be more manly, to take those privileges and those virtues that men have cordoned off for themselves. This discussion naturally divides the subject. I shall first consider women in the grand light of human creatures who, in common with men, are placed on this earth to unfold their faculties, and afterwards I shall particularly point out their peculiar designation. I wish also to steer clear of an error which many respectable writers have fallen into. The instruction which has hitherto been addressed to women has rather been applicable to ladies, and she puts that in capitals. But addressing my sex in a firmer tone, I pay particular attention to those in the middle class. This is notable because the talk about class structure in feminism is one that we're going to spend quite a bit of time on. Ladies, being upper class women, of course, weak, artificial beings, raised above the common wants and affectations of their race in a premature, unnatural manner, undermine the very foundation of virtue and spread corruption through the whole mass of society. As a class of mankind, they have the strongest claim to pity. The education of the rich tends to render them vain and helpless, and the unfolding mind is not strengthened by the practice of those duties which dignify the human character. They only live to amuse themselves by the same law which in nature invariably produces certain effects. They soon only afford barren amusement. This is interesting. This feels like a direct attack on her contemporary Jane Austen, who, as I say, went by a lady. That there's a group of upper class women whose existence is effectively pointless, who aren't suffering in any way. They're amusing themselves, but they're spreading a form of corruption through the rest of society. They're undermining the foundations of virtue and will soon provide only barren amusement. They've lived lives to amuse themselves, and when they are no longer pretty, no longer the desirable thing, they will cease to amuse anyone. My own sex will, I hope, excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. I earnestly wish to point out what true dignity and human happiness consists. I wish to persuade women to endeavour to acquire strength both of mind and body, and to convince them that soft phrases, susceptibility of heart, delicacy of sentiment, and refinement of taste are almost synonymous with epithets of weakness, and that those beings who are only the objects of pity and that kind of love which has been termed sister will soon become objects of contempt. Dismissing then those pretty feminine phrases which men condescendingly use to soften our slavish dependence, and despising that weak elegancy of mind, exquisite sensibility, and sweet docility of manners, supposed to be the sexual characteristics of the weaker vessel, I wish now to show that elegance is inferior to virtue, that the first object of laudable ambition is to obtain a character as a human being, regardless of the distinction of sex, and that secondary views should be brought to this simple touchstone. I'll leave you to consider those questions alone, and you've got my email address. If you wish to email me to ask me for that extract, please do so. Otherwise, you can probably find it by just Googling a few terms for it. It's very out of copyright. So that's our first wave. And then we come to the second wave. I've picked from very late in second wave feminism, a speech by Andrea Dworkin, available in this recently published collection of the writings of Andrea Dworkin, Last Days at Hot Slips. Andrea Dworkin is probably the most radical of the mainstream second wave feminists. 199 in my copy. By the way, she's going to talk about an image, and that's the image. It's a magazine cover of a pornographic magazine called Hustler. I've thought a great deal about how a feminist like myself addresses an audience primarily of political men who say that they are anti-sexist. I thought a lot about whether there should be a qualitative difference in the kind of speech I address to you. And then I found myself incapable. By the way, this is talking to a conference of men, a conference of the National Organization for Changing Men, so a conference of anti-sexist men, or men who Andrea Dworkin says claim to be anti-sexist. The idea of this speech is that men haven't gone nearly far enough, aren't really taking misogyny seriously. So this is late in the second wave, and she feels that men are dragging their feet without men taking real action and fundamentally addressing the flaws in their sex and in their society. There will be no real progress for women, and particularly progress with regards to sexual violence and what we talk about as being the rape culture, which isn't just the culture that permits and fails to acknowledge forcible rape. It's the culture of female sexual exploitation. It's a culture in which consent is often not given on an equal basis, on a basis of equality. And then I found myself incapable of pretending that I really believe that qualitative difference exists. I have watched the men's movement for many years. I'm close with some of the people who participate in it. I can't come here as a friend, even though I might very much want to. What I would like to do is scream. And in that scream, I would have the screams of the raped, the sobs of the battered. Even worse, in the center of that scream, I would have the deafening sound of women's silence. The silence into which we are born because we are women, and in which most of us will die. And if there would be a plea or a question or a human address in that scream, it would be this: why are you so slow? Why are you so slow to understand the simplest things? Not the complicated ideological things. You understand those. The simple things, the cliches. Simply that women are precisely human to the degree and quality you are. And also that we don't have time. We women, we don't have forever. Some of us don't have another week or another day to take time for you to discuss whatever it is that will enable you to go out into those streets and do something. We are very close to death. All women are. And we are very close to rape. And we are very close to beating. And we are inside a system of humiliation from which there is no escape for us. We use statistics not to try to quantify the injuries, but to convince the world that those injuries even exist. The statistics are not abstractions. It's easy to say, the statistics, somebody writes them up one way and somebody writes them up another way. That's true. But I hear about the rapes one by one by one by one, which is also how they happen. The statistics are not abstract to me. Every 3 minutes, a woman is being raped. Every 18 seconds, a woman is being beaten. There's nothing abstract about it. It's happening right now as I'm speaking. And it is happening for a simple reason. There is nothing complex and difficult about the reason. Men are doing it because of the kind of power that men have over women. That power is real, concrete, exercised from one body to another body, exercised by someone who feels he has a right to exercise it, exercised in public and exercised in private. It is the sum and substance of women's oppression. It's not done 5,000 miles away or 3,000 miles away. It is done here and it is done now. And it is done by people in this room as well as by other contemporaries, our friends, our neighbors, people that we know. Women don't have to go to school to learn about power. We just have to be women walking down the street or trying to get the housework done after having given one's body in marriage, then having no rights over it. The power exercised by men day to day in life is power that is institutionalized. It is protected by law. It is protected by religion and religious practices. It is protected by universities, which are strongholds of male supremacy. It is protected by the police force. It is protected by those whom Shelley called the unacknowledged legislators of the world, the poets, the artists. Against that power, we have silence. And note again this link that she makes explicitly into literature, that our subject is the study of the stories that we tell about society. So when we talk about a societal issue like this, we need to think about the stories we're telling about it. It is an extraordinary thing to try to understand and confront why it is that men believe, and men do believe, that they have the right to rape. Men may not believe it when asked. Everyone, raise your hands who believes they have the right to rape. Not too many hands will go up. It's in life that men believe they have the right to forced sex, which they don't call rape. And it is an extraordinary thing to try to understand that men really believe that they have the right to hit and hurt. And it is an equally extraordinary thing to try to understand that men really believe they have the right to buy a woman's body for the purpose of having sex, that is a right. And it is a very amazing to try to understand that men believe that the $7 billion a year industry that provides men with cunts is something men have a right to. That is the way the power of men is manifest in real life. That is what the theory of male supremacy means. It means you can rape. It means you can hit. It means you can hurt. It means you can buy and sell women. It means that there is a class of people there to provide you with all that you need. You stay richer than them so that they have to sell you sex, not just on street corners, but in the workplace. Oh, that's another right you can presume to have. Sexual access to any woman in your environment when you want. Now, the men's movement suggests that men don't want that kind of power I've just described. I've actually heard explicit whole sentences to that effect, and yet everything is a reason not to do something about changing the fact that you do have that power. Hiding behind guilt, that's my favorite. I love that one. Oh, it's horrible. Yes, I'm so sorry. You have the time to feel guilty. We don't have the time for you to feel guilty. Your guilt is a form of acquiescence in what continues to occur. Your guilt helps keep things the way they are. I've heard in the last several years a great deal about the suffering of men over sexism. Of course, I've heard a great deal about the suffering of men all my life. Needless to say, I've read Hamlet. I've read King Lear. I'm an educated woman. I know that men suffer. This is a new wrinkle. Implicit in the idea that this is a different kind of suffering is the claim, I think, that in part you are actually suffering because of something that you know happens to someone else, that would indeed be you. But mostly your guilt, your suffering reduces to, gee, we feel really so bad. Everything makes me bad. What you do, what you don't do, what you want to do, what you don't want to do, but are going to do anyway. I think that most of your distress is, gee, we really feel so bad. I'm sorry that you feel so bad, so uselessly and stupidly bad, because there is a way in which this is really your tragedy. And I don't mean because there's no real intimacy in your lives. I don't mean because the armor that you have to live with as men is stultifying, and I don't doubt that it is. I don't mean any of that. I mean that there is a relationship between the way that women are raped, and your socialization to rape, and the war machine that grinds you up and spits you out, the war machine you go through, just like that when woman went through Larry Flint's meat grinder on the cover of Hustler. You damn well better believe that you're involved in this tragedy and that it's your tragedy too, because you're turned into little soldier boys from the day that you are born, and everything that you learn about how to avoid the humanity of women becomes part of the militarization of this country in which you live and the world in which you live. It is also part of the economy that you frequently claim to protest. And the problem is that you think it's out there. It's not out there. It's in you. The pimps and the warmongers speak for you. Rape and war are not so different. And what the pimps and the warmongers do is they make you so proud of being men who can get it up and give it hard. And they take that acculturated sexuality and they put you in little uniforms and they send you out to kill and to die. I'm not going to stress that's more important than what you do to women. I think that's more important than what you do to women, because I don't. So again, worth noting, concentrating on these questions. Now, a bell's about to ring. I'm about to have a lesson to teach in person. So I am going to say, have a look at the video, which you can see hyperlinked there. Obviously, the hyperlink won't exist when you see this video, but it is on my YouTube channel. And please excuse me for looking very, very shabby in it. It was lockdown one. I was recording an awful lot of stuff straight to YouTube for students. It's self-isolating. Not self-isolating. Oh, it was self-isolating. Students at home. School wasn't open because we couldn't do induction, which to an extent we can't really do this year. Not fully. So good luck, and I look forward to. I'm going to record the rest of these lessons. I look forward to seeing you all in December. Goodbye, everyone.